Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and tonight we are talking about Wayward Sisters and what could have been. But before we dive into that, let my wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Carole.
Hi, I'm Carole Stokes. I'm here under that on Facebook. On Twitter, you can find me under true_firesign10. I'm a fanfic writer, and you can find all of that on AO3 under firesign10. I've been a Supernatural fan since season 3, started writing in 2012, and haven't stopped.
Very good. Anne?
Hi, I'm Ann Wicker, and I'm a latecomer to the Supernatural fandom, but once I did, I went completely down the rabbit hole. And I'm a Dean girl who is, as one of our fans puts it, Sam Curious. Anyway, I love Supernatural and I love talking about it. I'm also a former journalist and now a writer and editor. And I edited a book with Ann Moses, who was the teen editor of Tiger Beat magazine back in the 60s and early 70s. And I also edited a book about music in North and South Carolina called Making Notes.
Very good. Elektra?
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor, and I will write pretty much anything you ask me to do. I do a lot of alternate history, and I just found out I got a call out on the nominations for the Sideways Awards for alternate history for a story I wrote back in 2019 called O-Rings, about what would have happened if the space shuttle had not exploded. So almost an honorable mention, but not quite.
Lola?
My name's Lola Laracy. If you Google me, you'll find me, and I'm not kidding. You'll also find my forebears, who are all dead. Laracy spelled L-A-R-I-S-C-Y, and I'm a writer, and some of this stuff I kind of gave up on. I was a podcaster, but I decided to quit. That's okay. That's another conversation. So mainly, I'm a writer right now.
Awesome. And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. I write epic fantasy and urban fantasy, and as Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance, but all of the modern worlds are ones Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. I run the Supernatural TFWNC group, and I'm usually here on Continual running the Supernatural track. So let's dive in. Wayward Sisters was supposed to be a pilot for a spin-off of Supernatural. Lots of people had high hopes. I'm going to sneeze, or maybe not. And it didn't take. So what do you think, what would have been, first let's start with what they planned, and then we can talk about what might have been. So what are your thoughts about how they tried to create Wayward Sisters?
Okay. I know that there are folks who did not love this. I'm going to come down on the side of people who, I loved this episode when it came out, and I apparently missed the boat and didn't know it was a backdoor pilot.
Okay.
And when I watched this episode for the first time, and I saw that call out back to that first episode of Supernatural, where Jody calls up Claire and says, you know, I haven't heard from Sam and Dean, you know, they went off on a hunting trip and I haven't heard from them for a while. And that just swept me right back to the pilot, where Dean shows up at Sam's apartment and says, it's about Dad, you know, he's been off on a hunting trip and he haven't heard from him for a while. And that kickstarted the whole series. I bought into the whole concept, hook, line, and sinker.
Okay. Lola?
I'm still waiting for the series. I check the fall schedule every year and it's not there. I don't understand what the problem was. They had great characters, great actors. I rewatched the pilot, the backdoor pilot today, and I'm reminding how much I loved Kaya, although I guess we would get a different kind, but and Patience, because I remember, I loved her character's grandmother and that whole storyline. I love that, and I just thought they all gelled so well. And I wanted to see the family atmosphere of Jody and the girls sitting down to dinner, and then Donna coming in every once in a while and saying, "You betcha, I'm from Minnesota," and it would have been perfect. I would have loved it. And I guess the people at CW don't understand that like 95% of their audience is female. And we would have loved it. I don't understand where, because I read an article on Wiki and it said the CW guy said, "Oh, well, we decided to go with legacies." I'm not knocking legacies, but I'm like, there's a whole bunch more people who would have rather seen Wayward Sisters. So I'm still bummed, and it's been like 3 years.
Okay, Anne?
I have to agree. I watched that episode and I was already a huge fan of Jody and a big fan of Donna. And unlike, I mean, you and I disagree on this, Gail. I like Claire. And I just thought this is a great concept. And like Lola, I figure, okay, their target audience is younger people, but there's a whole audience that I think the CW just didn't really appreciate. And I'm not their target demographic by a long shot. And I think that they could have really hit on an audience that they didn't have with this show. And yes, a lot of us women watch Supernatural because they're two really good looking men. But we also like really powerful, in charge women who can take care of themselves. And one doesn't cancel out the other. And that's what they didn't understand.
That makes sense. Carole?
But the original concept of the show, I thought was terrific. I was very excited. I really wanted to see Jody and Donna have their moment in the sun, have some, a chance to show even more what they could do. I liked the idea of them training. They were a little more based where Sam and Dean were on the road all the time. Donna and Jody were more of a fixed point, and therefore they could actually start training people and take them in. They already had taken in Claire, they took in Alex. It was a good starting point. So as far as the concept went, I was down with it. We'll talk more, I'm sure, about the actual.
That's a really good point you bring up. That one of the things that really didn't gel for me with Supernatural was the whole idea of the boys spending all their time at the first 8 season traveling and scamming credit cards for their money and betting on pool games to survive and not having jobs when it seemed like most of the other hunters had day jobs. And particularly Donna and Jody seemed to have the ideal jobs in law enforcement, where they had access to all the information and resources. They could look up things. They could talk to the coroner. They didn't have to lie about who they were. And that was the perfect place to start sending off hunters to go, right, this one's clearly a vampire kill. I'll get a hunter on that. It corrected some of the issues with the idea of John and the boys traipsing around hunting full time.
Yeah, I love the idea of Jody and Donna. And I think if I'd have had more time to warm up to the girls, other than Claire, but they kind of came in quick succession. It was like, which one is that? Oh, yeah. And we didn't get to know them real well before, bam, it's the spinoff, except for Claire, who was written very sharp edged. And I just couldn't, I just, she was too sharp-edged, too
She was a
sharp-edged.
brat. She's a brat.
Well, that's one of the words you could use. I haven't forgiven her yet for trying to get Dean killed. She just was too extra. But I thought Patience was intriguing. I thought I liked Kaya. I just didn't get enough of a sense of them. So maybe that would have made a difference for me if we'd have gotten to know the girls a little better before it was suddenly spin-off time. Because Jody and Donna were great. And I love the idea of them nurturing the next generation of hunters and maybe trying to help them avoid some of the trauma that kind of the men just said, yeah, that's just part of the job. And the women are going, maybe you don't have to be totally screwed up to do this job. Not that it won't do a number on you, but maybe we can make this work better. So I could see that happening. And I could also have imagined something more like Gunpowder Milkshake, where you brought an ensemble cast of some of the more mature female characters like Missouri and like Ellen or Pamela, or some of the more mature characters who all kicked ass and took names. That would have been fun too. So there were a lot of different directions that it could have gone. And I do think that the CW wanted to pack those teenagers in there and totally ignored that we exist and
we have the money.
Yes, I was going to say, and pay a whole lot of money to go to Supernatural cons and get those good seats. So they're just not putting two and two together here very well. So where could you have, envision, if you will, where Wayward Sisters might have gone plot-wise if it had happened? Anne?
Well, I think that it would have been probably, there would have been a lot about the training aspect. And I think that sorry, Gail, I think that Claire would have been a really big part of that. But hear me out, that Claire was kind of the female Dean. She had that edge that Dean had a lot earlier on. And I think that, she was all about charging in without a plan, guns blazing. That's Dean all over, and also I think it was because of her traumatic childhood she had a different traumatic childhood than Dean and Sam, but it was a traumatic childhood and she had a lot to cope with from the get-go. And so I think that moving forward, we would have seen them training a new generation. I liked the aspect of Patience being the psychic, which we only got bits and pieces of that with Missouri and Pamela through. That was not a storyline they did very much in Supernatural, which I think that could have been not just with Pamela and Missouri, but could have been another avenue, besides demons and angels and whoever else. Psychics could have been much more of a hunter ally than they ever exploited with Pamela and Missouri. Although I think maybe Missouri was much more of an ally to John Winchester than, in my head canon, I think she was. And somebody wrote, I don't know who it was, Carole, maybe wrote about that in their head canon, Sam and Dean got left with Missouri a lot when they were younger, maybe more than with Bobby or with Pastor Jim or whatever. And maybe that's why they were so polite. But anyway, I think that they really missed the boat on, because they could also have introduced, it didn't have to be just sisters. There could have been some younger brothers too, some younger wayward men who got sucked into the whole hunter thing. And I mean, I don't think that it being Wayward Sisters would have precluded that. And that could have been, I mean, the CW could have exploited that with their whole teen romance shit. Sorry, that they tend to like.
Okay, Elektra.
Sam used to send out at some later point, Sam was sending out some of the Apocalypse World hunters out in teams and trying to train them up. And this could have opened up to a whole world of learning to send out the right kind of people for the right kind of job. When you have more things available to you. And, you know, sometimes the women are the people who do things smart. You know, we don't just look at everything and say, right, I've got a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. We start saying, wait, no, that's a screw. I'm going to go get a screwdriver and do this right. And I could really see them, you know, building this into, we're going to need to send the right sort of people out to solve this, not, oh, we'll just send whoever's closest.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Elektra.
it just sounds like this could have really been built into a smart thing with a real information gathering and planning and doing things smart, because as women, they weren't necessarily able to brute force it the way Sam and Dean so often did.
Good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Lola?
And you know, when I rewatched Wayward Sisters today, I was thinking about how bright the show was, because it's in a practical location in a town, you know, at her house. And it was very homey feeling. And that kind of gave it a sort of salve right there. And most of the Supernatural episodes are very dark and broody, you know, take place at 3 o'clock in the morning or underground. And I'm kind of thinking, this is a nice break. I like this, being in a house. There's sunshine, there's an actual sun. Well, except for when they're in the other world, but you know what I mean. In Sioux Falls, there's an actual sun and greenery and stuff. And I'm like, I could get used to this. It's like real life. I like it. So it would have been nice to have that counter to the dark, broody boys.
Okay, Carole?
I like what Lola's saying in terms of here we have this very different atmosphere, and it would have been that would have been certainly interesting, because when it's dark and creepy, we expect bad, spooky things to happen. But when it's bright and sunshiny, we don't. And so to have that kind of environment and still have them battling these things would have been interesting. My biggest thing was that I just really wanted to see Donna and Jody in charge. You know, I wanted to see them driving this, and I wanted the girls to be part of it, but not the main instigators necessarily of it, if that makes sense. I mean, in Supernatural, we have Sam and Dean, and then we have all these other very important people like Bobby and so on. And so I would have liked Donna and Jody to be the Sam and Dean size roles. And then we have these other people playing their parts. I understand that Claire had a very traumatic life, but I often still wanted to smack her. She was so unremittingly abrasive. I would have been down with be abrasive, but maybe there's still some moment at some point of something to show that she had any other emotion besides hostility, you know. And even in the first episode, fine, they've only just found her and her life's been crap and she's being used by this guy and she doesn't know it and so on and so forth. But later on, even after she's been living with Jody and, you know, this faux sister, you know, sisterly person of Alex and stuff, there's just not an iota to me of affection or feeling like she's part of a team or anything. And that to me really undercut the whole point of them being a unified force. She had no interest in being unified. She just wanted to go off and do her thing. And so that kind of undermined that for me. So between Claire's determination to just be abrasive and alone, and the focus shifting from Donna and Jody to these other girls, really kind of broke the mold of what I was hoping to see.
And you looked like you were dying to say something.
Yeah, and I get what you're saying, Carol, and I agree with you totally about that. I wanted to see Donna and Jody be the Sam and Dean of the show and to be in charge. But I also think that they were beginning, and if they had been given the chance, they could have, I could see Claire softening. She fell in love with Kaya. You know, it was that first tentative love, reaching out kind of thing. And I saw her soften with that.
You make a point. You absolutely make a point there. And of course, we never got to see.
No, we didn't get to
so
see it.
Maybe more of that could have happened.
Yeah.
Once again, see, for me, Patience and Kaya were paper dolls. I didn't feel they had any substance. And this is just my opinion, and I say it respectfully because I know you all like this more. But nothing engaged me about them. They were there because they were brought there and they were told to be there. They were told to do these things. And at no point was I caught up in their personalities. Now, by contrast, the first time we saw Donna, we were caught up in her personality. The first time we saw Missouri, who only had one episode ever, not counting the one where she got killed off, we were captivated by Missouri. We saw Asa Fox, and he was dead, but they brought us into his personality. And I just felt that Patience and Kaya were these blank ciphers. And could they have developed? Absolutely. But they didn't hook enough from the get-go to make it happen.
Well, not compared to Chrissy, who didn't stay in the life, or the one who got killed by, she came over from the AU world and from the alternate world. And she got
Greg or something. Yeah.
Margie?
Yeah.
Something. Yeah.
Her. Both of them, I thought, even though they had very small roles, I felt more connection to them. They felt more well-rounded as a person. So I could really, I would have loved to have seen more of them. I agree. I think the writing was thin on Patience and Kaya's episodes. And they didn't give us that. And that's not on the actresses, that's on the writers for not making.
Absolutely not. None of this is on the actresses. This is all on the writers.
I understand what you're saying, but I also could see the people creating this trying desperately to say it would be more interesting going forward if, rather than a group of straight up humans, if we had some people who had some superpowers, for lack of a better word. And I see where they wanted to take it, but I will buy into it had to be Jody and Donna because those were the characters we all loved so much.
Right.
And I would give a lot to have a series just focused on the two of them.
Yes.
Well,
and I think that's what we even heard more about. And so I was like, yeah, this is great. If they had maybe not brought on both girls at once, maybe we could have just had Patience. And then the time that Kaya's character got could have all been on Patience. You know what I mean? So if we just had Patience introduced with her psychic abilities, which are undeniably a fantastic hunter's resource, to draw a parallel, visions are a huge thing in the Buffy Angel verse. And, this is the same thing. We could have had that, and Sam had his visions in the beginning. It was a driving force to saving people, and hunting things. So if we maybe had just taken all of the Patience Kaya time and devoted it just to Patience, we would have developed her a little more and felt more for her. And then in another episode or two, then we could have met Kaya. But doing it all at once, maybe it spread it too thin.
It's not like we just met these characters in one episode. I mean, we met Kaya through a couple of episodes well before this. And I think we had Patience in a different episode as well. It wasn't like they all got thrown into us at once.
But they didn't get a lot of track. I mean, for me, it was that we barely even got maybe half a season to keep them all straight. And I just didn't have enough time. They weren't clearly defined enough, and we didn't have enough time for me personally to care. Although they certainly had potential to develop. I loved the idea, like Lola was saying about, here you are in this ranch house in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but really they're running this whole operation to get rid of monsters. That's kind of cool. And I also loved, I always wanted to, and I've seen plenty of fan fiction that does take us through a version of Supernatural where Dean was supportive of Sam's visions and not always trying to shut him down. And obviously Dean was afraid for him, but who said, you know what, I don't get it, but I get you and I'm going to back you. And I think we could have had that with Patience, where everybody wasn't worried that she was going to be the boy king of hell, that they supported her abilities and didn't just constantly doubt her loyalty. And that would have been nice to see after what happened to Sam.
Oh, yeah.
And it's funny because, Gail, we watched another psychic episode last night about a town, where it's all psychics. And all the psychics were treated like 10 cent, dime novelty things. And so the show apparently didn't lend a lot of credence to organic psychic abilities, at least not back then. So it would have been nice to see Patience as a legitimate seer and see her develop that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when Bobby introduced Pamela, she's the best psychic in the state. So there was some history of psychics being consulted, or Bobby wouldn't have done it.
Well, and John went to Missouri.
Yeah.
So here we have John and Bobby trusting psychics, although certainly there's opportunity for fraud. Dean is a lot less trusting of anything. And of course, he's afraid for Sam, but it would have been interesting to take that positive spin on a psychic and maybe even start bringing in people with those natural abilities that are not demon blood or from deals, and say, hey, we're here to help. That could have been fun.
Well,
Oh, yeah.
another piece of this is whenever we see Sam and Dean, until they get the bunker, sitting down for a nice meal together, they're always like in Biggersons, pretty much, which became the big joke because they're all exactly alike. And I could totally have seen that these guys, well, yeah, go ahead, go clean out that vampire nest, but remember, dinner's at 7.
Well, and that episode,
come hell or high water, we are all going to get together and have family dinner every night. I could absolutely have seen them build it around that.
and that episode where Sam and Dean are there for dinner, and Dean is just saying, wow, you guys eat like this all the time. And Jody's going, it's chicken. I mean, this is so good.
And they leave with the stack of Tupperware.
Yeah, exactly.
And
They have to leave with the leftovers.
And then they have the whole sex education discussion over dinner, which is what happens in families. And yeah, that would have been great to have maybe that anchoring dinner hour in each episode or nearly each episode where that's how you end the episode. That could have been really cool.
The equivalent of Sam and Dean having their moment by the Impala. Here you'd have it over the dinner table.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And and the food thing is another aspect of it that, they always showed Bobby cooking things, but he never actually ate very much. He'd always get interrupted.
There was a little bit too much in Supernatural focused on the let's just have another beer or another drink to cope with this terrible life that we are all leading.
Hunter's helper.
Yeah, and
Really?
maybe women aren't quite focused quite that way when they're hunters.
Happily, at least in fanfic, you do get them, when they're drinking in the motel rooms, they are eating. Maybe it's because women write a lot of the fanfic, but they're always eating. They're always getting Chinese, or they're getting, they're getting
Pizza.
to
Pizza.
go to a restaurant, and and they eat much more in the stories than they do in the show.
I guess that's what I'm thinking about when I think counterbalance. It seems like Wayward Sisters would have been a nice counterbalance. You would have seen, maybe Sam and Dean might think of it as mundane, but the everyday aspects of life and how it plays out and how you integrate being a hunter into it. For instance, in the episode, the Wayward Sisters episode, Alex says, I have a job. And Claire says, I have a job too. I'm a hunter. And in my mind, I'm going, well, how do you pay for stuff? Well, we forging credit cards, stuff like that. No, how about be a productive member of society and still hunt? That's where my mind goes. That's where my almost 50-year-old mind goes. Now, maybe when I was 20, I would have been like, I'm a hunter, I'm cool. But 30 odd years later, I'm like, but how do you have a place to live? How do you put gas in your car? So it would have answered all those questions that we're thinking of, while the writers are just thinking about how cool it is to have a black Impala.
I think the reason that I get riled up about Wayward Sisters is because I was so disappointed. I was genuinely so excited when they were first talking about this. I was like, wow, here we have, two middle-aged women who are very competent and intelligent, and they've learned about what's out there and they deal with it. And to have a show with those characters in it, I was so excited. I was really, how often do we, at least the older we, feel undervalued, or, oh, well, we can't do anything because now we're older, or, who cares what they think? Let's get the teenagers and all of that. And to feel that somebody saw these people and realized how valuable they were and how interesting their stories could be. And then to have it, once again, in my opinion, so mishandled and mismanaged, and we lost that whole aspect. And I will totally grant, maybe it would have come into play. But if you're doing a backdoor pilot, you don't have any wiggle room. Even if you're doing a pilot, you probably have half a dozen shows, to make your mark. They're not going to cancel you before a certain, they want you to have that 4, 5, 6 shows to show your mettle. Are you catching them? Are the numbers at least going up and everything? Backdoor pilot, you don't get that. You've got to make that hit and you've got to make it count. And they didn't. And to see that slip off the hook like that was really so disappointing,
Well, and when you
That's
do,
where my angst comes from.
usually when you do see a show that does focus on women who are out of their 20s or maybe early 30s, then the whole focus is they're getting over a traumatic divorce and they're rebuilding their life. And
Oh my
it's-
God, menopause.
yeah, and so they're bonding over the fact that they're having midlife crises instead of, yeah, it's been a shitty day, let's go kill something. Now I could buy into that. I think that's a perfect antidote to PMS and menopause and everything else. Be great, rid the world of monsters and everybody has a good day. So yeah, I think at the end of it, you probably had a show about women written by men. That was kind of my feel.
Yes. And not just written by men, but written by men who did not understand women. And that's been a recurring thing through Supernatural that has often cropped up in other avenues where they're like, who wrote the women? Who wrote the woman who turned into a dog? I mean, come on. There was a number of those instances where we're like, clearly, these are not men, I don't know, who are getting any. I mean, really, they're not, they're not real swift about what's happening on the land of the female. And this was a crystallized example of that.
And I think going beyond that the powers that be, the upper level decision makers at the CW, at the production companies, didn't understand that either. They didn't understand that they needed women to write about women, and how much, again, I'll say how much they missed their audience, an audience that they could have tapped into.
Yeah.
Right.
Elektra, any thoughts on that?
I'll agree with you that they've always done a terrible job of writing women. I was just checking my notes on the fact that, it actually got good ratings when it aired.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was so much excitement about it.
Yeah, it just got, it was one of those, it got killed by circumstances. But I will absolutely agree that they just don't seem to understand how women work, despite the fact that from everything that we've heard, that being a woman on that set was apparently way better than being a woman on other TV sets.
Absolutely.
Despite that, apparently writing fictional women was not their forte. And they made a lot of missteps.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed
what to do with the extra parts.
Other places where terrible things are coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, we did have a female showrunner with Sarah Gamble. There were plenty of
briefly,
well, a couple of years there. And then there were several female script writers, but somehow when it came to Wayward Sisters, they either didn't get to write that script or they weren't listened to or something, because it just didn't strike me as authentic in the way that the best female relationships can be.
Mm-hmm.
The potential was endless.
What?
The potential there was absolutely endless.
Absolutely. There was so much could have done with that setup.
They could have gotten Donna together with a guy that wasn't a cop named Doug. I mean, she had a type, but maybe she could have busted out of it and found a guy that could cope with the fact that she monster hunted.
Jody could have had a foxhole encounter. Poor Jody.
Yeah, Jody was having her trouble finding guys, but
and she had that terrible date with the Crowley.
Oh God.
And they were, there were also the possibilities of some of the characters having relationships with hot men and women. It could have been a really interesting series that way.
Well, we could have seen Claire and Kaya and nobody had to die.
Yeah,
exactly.
That'd have been nice.
I like that idea. I didn't think about that till you said that, Anne. Yeah, that could have been part of why Claire was so devastated when Kaya died. She was developing feelings for Kaya.
Oh,
I like that. We could have totally seen that.
And that would have been a great avenue to, have Claire realize human connection is important and be able to start accepting affection and giving it and stuff. But once again, you know,
Well, and I think the Claire Kaya thing is actually canon, because Jody says something to Dean about, well, first crush, first love, all that. She's just getting back on her feet. So that relationship actually was canon.
mhm.
And it did eventually get regular Kaya back, and Dark Kaya, went off to the AU. But that could have been nice, and we could have seen a positive handling as opposed to what happened to Charlie twice.
Yeah.
So yeah, even if Jody didn't ever have a new guy, and that could have shown us an insight there too. No, I'm good. Everybody didn't have to pair up.
And there is a such thing as bisexuality. I'm just saying. Jody could have done some exploring, nothing wrong with that.
No, and there's nothing wrong with her deciding that, I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where I'm at in my life.
I mean, I was that way for a long time till I met my husband, which
Yeah.
was a total. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with her being a single woman, a strong single woman.
Mhm.
And that's what a lot of the powers that be don't get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was an awful lot of opportunity there to bring in things that would have made the show very interesting and very different from Supernatural's interpretation.
Mhm.
And we just didn't get a chance to go there, but it had tremendous potential.
Absolutely.
Maybe she could have found herself a nice, kind, nurturing guy that wanted to stay home and, build the household and cook the meals and,
Get the blood out of the clothing.
Learn how to do stitches.
yeah. You never know,
Yeah.
You could have hooked up with a nice EMS guy who would have patched them all up.
Exactly.
Run a hunter's medic clinic out of the basement.
You
Mhm.
could have met him through Alex. Alex works at the hospital. We're already writing the show for them.
Mm-hmm.
So many things we'll never know.
That would have been a great sideline. Would have been not just, and then maybe Alex goes off and starts also caring for some of the supernatural critters that aren't actually monsters, and learns something about supernatural physiology, which comes in handy when you want to kill them when they're not nice.
Mhm.
Because nobody's been studying that all that much beyond how do you kill them.
Well, and
He studies why.
and Sam and Dean, with the episodic nature of especially those first seasons and how they were constantly on the road, when you ran into somebody who had, even another hunter who had devastating consequences from a hunt that didn't go well, oh well, see you later, we're in a new city next week. Well, what about some sort of network that tried to, recovering hunter network, because they can't go to a regular psychologist and say, demons made my husband drink Drano and I just don't know how to get over it. I mean, that's just not going to fly. But I could also have seen them, Jody and Donna, being kind of the nexus for a lot of these things that were hunter adjacent, to try to create less self-destructive hunters.
There was somebody who was doing that though. Oh goodness, it was a shapeshifter maybe, who was doing psychiatric work, remember?
And she
Yeah,
would turn into the deceased person so they could talk and hug and
Yeah.
stuff and have closure.
So it was somebody who was using their power for good.
Mhm.
And that was, so yeah, because not all monsters are monsters.
And that reminds me of Garth.
Mhm.
Garth went to become a dentist for werewolves. Who because they need dentistry too. I love that. I'm like, yes. And they need more of that. That's one of the things that, bugs
All
me
those
about
canines.
Supernatural is that they made all the monsters evil. It's like, no, they're not all evil. They're people. They're people that got turned into these things, or they grew up this way, but they still have souls and hearts. Let's let them thrive.
I mean, maybe Garth could have done orthodontia for vampires, the vegetarian vampires, like Lenore and those guys.
Yeah.
Because they've got a mouthful of teeth. Somebody's got to take care of them.
Yeah.
Well, and Bess bringing the guys in when her cousin showed up with a wraith wound,
Mhm,
and them getting mixed up in the whole monster on monster hunting.
mhm.
The monster fight club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of interesting potential stuff, and definitely like the medical clinics and the psychiatric work. And there's a lot of people who, when they cross the line and their families get involved because of an attack, you can become a hunter, but maybe there's room for people who become other things when they find out about that world.
Yeah.
Because they already have those skills, maybe there's a shrink who becomes a shrink for hunters and monsters who, I'm a vampire and I hate what I am, but I'm not killing people. I'm getting my blood from blood banks, or I'm getting my blood from cattle, or
Well,
but
Benny
it
was getting his
disgusts
blood
me,
from
and I think
blood
it's the
bank.
sight of blood.
Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of opportunities there, and we didn't get to see them. Well,
I'm
folks,
so bummed I missed all of that. I wish they'd done it.
and believe it or not, we have blown through our time. So much to
Okay.
talk about. We always do this, but thank you so much for being here. And before we leave, please go around and let everybody know where they can find you online. Lola?
I'm Lola Laracy. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, to Twitch. I'm just about everywhere. My last name is spelled Laristy.
Awesome. Elektra?
Elektra Hammond, you can find anything you need to know at untilmidnight.com.
And Anne?
I'm Ann Wicker on Facebook, and on Instagram, I'm Ann Wicker, Ann.Wicker2. And on Twitter, I'm also Ann Wicker with no spaces.
Very good. Carole?
On Twitter, I'm true_firesign10. All of my fictions on AO3 under firesign10. And I'm here on Facebook as Carole Stokes. You'll see me in Gail's TFWNC Supernatural group and on Continual.
And you can find me at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. All my social media is a variation of those names. I do run the Supernatural TFWNC group here on Facebook, but most of the time you can find me here on Continual. So thank you to our wonderful, wonderful panelists for another great discussion. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up here on Continual, so we'll see you online.